Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to dive right in today. We're talking about the absolute bombshell collapse of a company called Stocks and Securities Limited, or SSL. This is a story of massive fraud, one that didn't just rattle Jamaica's entire financial system. It completely wiped out the life savings of one of the world's most famous athletes.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. First up, the big heist, what blew the lid off this whole thing. Then, we'll look at the two very different faces of this company. After that, we'll see how the cracks started to show, and then dig into a whole history of red flags that were basically ignored. We'll wrap up by looking at how the entire system collapsed and, the fallout from it all. All right, let's jump in.
Okay, so first up, the billion-dollar heist. Let's start with the one single event that really brought this whole house of cards crashing down.
So you might think a huge financial scandal like this would be uncovered by, a sharp-eyed auditor or a regulator, right? Nope. This whole thing exploded into the public eye because of one person, the world's fastest man, Usain Bolt, or more specifically, a massive, gaping hole in his retirement fund.
And we're not talking about a small amount here. He had almost 13 million US dollars in his account with SSL. This was money he'd been saving since 2012. This was supposed to be his pension, his nest egg for life after sprinting, the whole 9 yards.
So get this, his team goes to check the account in early 2023, and what do they find? $12,000. That's it. From nearly 13 million down to 12,000. Just gone. And that's the real question, isn't it? What on earth was going on inside this company for that to even be possible?
Well, that brings us to our next section, because the story SSL told the public was, let's just say it was very different from the reality.
See, from the outside looking in, SSL looked like a rock star. They were known as Jamaica's IPO factory. They were the go-to guys for taking big companies public. And these weren't small deals. They were often massively oversubscribed. They were so well respected, they even managed the IPO for the Jamaica Stock Exchange itself. You can't get a better seal of approval than that, right? They seemed totally bulletproof.
But that's where the story gets wild. You've got this public image of a successful, buttoned-up wealth manager for the elite, and then you have the private reality. While they were popping champagne for another successful IPO, the fraud was allegedly already happening, starting way back in 2010. And get this, behind the scenes, regulators were already throwing up red flags, calling the company unsafe and unsound. Just a massive disconnect.
Okay, so the cracks really start to show. And it wasn't just the fraud, you see. The company was also making some truly terrible business decisions that were just hemorrhaging money.
Take their attempt to get into venture capital. They launched this new arm, SSL, to invest in small companies. And it was a complete and utter train wreck. It was like a black hole for cash. By 2020, it was sitting on a deficit of over 300 million Jamaican dollars. It got so bad another company had to step in and buy it out just to stop the bleeding.
And if you want a perfect example of the chaos, look no further than this, the Papa John's pizza disaster. I'm not kidding. They apparently took client money, again, think of Usain Bolt's retirement fund, to back a pizza franchise in the Cayman Islands. And it failed so spectacularly that the business literally got evicted for not paying rent. That one little adventure left a $222 million debt on the books, a debt that was really owed back to their clients. Now here's the thing that's really going to make you scratch your head. This whole collapse, it shouldn't have been a surprise at all. Why? Because the people in charge of watching the henhouse knew for over a decade that SSL was a problem. Let's walk through this timeline of warnings. The regulator, the FSC, was onto them for years. It starts back in 2008. They find out SSL doesn't have enough capital. Fast forward to 2013, they have to put restrictions on their business. By 2016, the language gets stronger. They're officially called unsafe and unsound. And by 2020, they're straight up banned from taking on new clients. And yet, after all that, they were still in business. How does that happen? So that's the million-dollar question, right? Why didn't any of these warnings actually work? Well, because this wasn't just one bad apple or one dumb investment. This was a total systemic collapse. The whole system failed.
Let's look at how it all fell apart. First, their internal controls were basically non-existent. A single advisor could just go in and change records with no one checking. Second, the regulators, well, they saw the problems, but they just didn't seem to have the teeth to shut SSL down for good. And here's the big one. Their whole business model was incredibly risky. SSL was its own custodian for billions of dollars in client assets.
It's like letting the fox guard the henhouse with no fence.
Yeah, let's talk about this off-balance sheet thing for a second, because it's super important. Basically, SSL was holding on to about 30 billion Jamaican dollars of their client stuff. Stocks, bonds, you name it. But because it was off-balance sheet, it didn't show up on SSL's own financial statements. Think of it this way. They're holding your wallet for you, but they don't have to report what's inside it. This setup made it almost impossible to see what was really happening and gave them way too much control over money that wasn't theirs.
Which brings us to the fallout. After everything imploded, we finally got a look at the books, and it was ugly. For the people who lost their money, the chances of getting it back looked incredibly slim.
So, you might think, what about insurance? There was a $1 million Fidelity insurance policy, which is supposed to cover this kind of theft. But here's the final insult. That entire $1 million, it got eaten up by the operating expenses of the people brought in to manage the collapse, every single penny. So the victims, the people the insurance was meant to protect, got nothing.
And check this out. This chart really shows you where a lot of the money went. It wasn't just one person dipping into an account. The company was basically loaning out hundreds of millions of client dollars to other companies. And the real kicker? Those other companies were also owned by the same principals as SSL. It was a shell game, moving money from one failing venture to another, creating massive debts that they probably knew would never be paid back.
And look, the official forensic audit basically confirmed it. This wasn't some lone wolf employee gone rogue. The report used the phrase much broader than initially understood. We're talking about a total failure of management, a systemic rot right through the core of the company. And that's why this whole story is so important. It's a textbook case of what happens when the systems designed to protect us just completely break down.
So the legal mess is still ongoing. And honestly, the big questions aren't just about the money anymore. It's about accountability. When you have a company with a decade of red flags, a decade of warnings from the supposed watchdogs, and it still leads to this kind of disaster, you have to ask yourself a bigger question. Is that just negligence, or is it something more? And at the end of the day, who pays the price for a nation's broken trust?